Today I'm going to be talking about the historical critical method and specifically some of the limitations that the historical critical method has. Christianity, by nature, it is historical, right? We make historical claims. Theology itself is historical because Christ became man. The incarnation puts the eternal word, the eternal logos, within time and space, within a particular cultural and historical moment. So we can't, as Christians, we can't ignore historical data. We can't try to bring our own modern Christianity worldview and then try to retrofit that onto the facts. We have to be willing to be challenged by the facts as they show up, and we just can't settle for this comfortable, purely spiritualized idea of Christianity. Scholars, they often know the Bible better than Christians do, and they know the Christian history better than Christians do. Yet they are often very frequently ignored by Christians, or they're kind of criticized. Christians who are really being challenged by their pre-existing worldview, how they thought Christianity went is not how it went. And that's very challenging. But then this creates this frustrating situation where the expert in the history is being basically ignored in favor of this other worldview. And it creates sort of this reactive tone, right? That's a frustrating position to be in. If you're an expert on something and you're not taken seriously in your expertise, it just lends itself towards something that is reactionary and often has like these tones. I understand why that is. So I guess I just want to be clear right up front. This is not a critique of tone. It is a critique of methodology. And let's first define the role of historical criticism. The job of historians is to investigate the accidental features of history, right? The specific events, the places, the languages, the socio-political influences, just all these circumstances that shaped what happened. And historians are trained to look at the available evidence to kind of reconstruct the historical context and then deduce causal understandings between those events. The method is very valuable for understanding what happened and then how events unfolded, right? But I think where sometimes historians tend to overstep the boundaries of what we've just described, of their methodology, while they may accurately map the sequence of historical events, the actual interpretation of those events often involve philosophical assumptions. Usually mechanist, like post-Enlightenment frameworks that treat the world as more closed off, that are more material. So most people, if you don't have a philosophy if you don't know philosophy and you haven't studied it, most likely you're a mechanist of some kind. So these assumptions themselves are not historical facts. Like philosophy is a different subject than history, but it does frame how you understand history and just perceive the facts on the paper. So historians explore causal relationships, right? But that's kind of limited to immediate events that then bring about the change in a linear fashion of the next event. So maybe this war caused this migration, which led to this reform movement or something like that. But what the historical method cannot speak to, cannot address, is whether there are final or metaphysical causes. And those would be the ultimate reasons why anything happens and what its ultimate meaning might be, or the essential nature of an event. So in other words, tracing a timeline of events is not the same thing as understanding the deeper nature of time itself, of causality in the scientific sense or the metaphysical sense, or meaning, right? It cannot answer those questions. We all bring our own presuppositions. We all bring our own perspective, our own thoughts on those topics to this assessment of the historical facts. But it should be said that historians themselves can tell us about history, but they cannot tell us about metaphysics. So it's important to recognize that all historical interpretations, no matter who you are, come with philosophical commitments. And these are often unspoken, they're sometimes taken for granted even. And that shapes how the facts themselves are understood. So secular historians often rely on assumptions about materialism and linear causality without always making those assumptions explicit. So this is not a failure on their part necessarily, but it's just the limitation of the historical method itself. It cannot speak to questions beyond the role of empirical data and in linear chronology. Because of these limits, it's just worth cultivating intellectual humility, right, about what historical criticism can truly achieve. It excels at reconstructing what happened, but then it has to be silent on why it happened in any ultimate sense, right? Other frameworks like theology can offer alternative ways of interpreting history, not alternative historical facts, though. That's important, right? But alternative ways of interpreting the historical facts. And those focus more on final causes and meaning. And recognizing these frameworks, they're distinct, but they're complementary. They're not competing in the Christian eyes, right? They can enrich our understanding without dismissing history. So my critique is not of historians or facts, but of the tendency to present their interpretations as if they were purely objective or exhaustive. So every interpretation is filtered through philosophical lenses, whether that's acknowledged or not. And if we are to engage with history fairly, we must be clear about those assumptions and then open to other interpretive frameworks, including theological ones, that ask different questions beyond the historical method scope. So as I mentioned earlier, the sequencing of events, X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened, is not the same thing as understanding the causality of time itself. The danger is confusing the horizontal unfolding of events with the vertical questions of origin, meaning, and ultimate end, right? Those belong to philosophy and to theology. So while the historical method gives us insight into what happened, it is not equipped to explain why anything happened in the most fundamental sense, or whether history has an inherent direction at all. Okay? So to ask that question, we have to go beyond that horizontal event timeline and consider the structure of time itself. So I'm going forward, I'm not going to so much present a positive case for my worldview as much as I'm going to try to challenge the assumptions of historical critical scholars. I'm saying this is not a question history can answer. Whether or not you believe this, it does not matter, but this is not your scope as a historian. You can certainly have thoughts about that as a person, but as a historian, that's not your scope. And so your expertise is undoubtedly connected to how you perceive the world. At the same time, I'm challenging not what you've presented to me as facts, but how you interpreted those facts. And we can agree on the historical data. I'll believe what you say. So now I'm going to use physics to sort of challenge that assumption. So modern physics increasingly suggests that time may not simply be another coordinate of space, but a dimension with its own properties. So some models suggest that time might be more fixed or directional or deterministic, while the spatial arrangements are more probabilistic. Right? So I'm going to use gravity then as this sort of metaphor. Gravity doesn't determine my precise choices. It doesn't determine where I will be at a particular point in time necessarily. But what it does shape the field of what's physically possible. So within gravity, I have my limits, but I also have freedom within gravity, right? I can't sit on the ceiling, but I can sit on my chair. So the accidental arrangement of me, it has this degree of flexibility, but neither is it totally can go any direction. So likewise, if time is structured, right, or directional, like physics suggests that it is, then it may set boundary conditions for what futures are possible long before they even unfold. And just like a plant grows, right, there's some degree of randomness in how a plant's going to grow. How much rain it gets, how much wind it gets, right? But it also is not purely random. It always grows up. It's not going to grow down into the ground. It grows up because it grows towards the sun. So the growth has this degree of freedom, effects of randomness, but it is also drawn towards something. and it doesn't choose this direction in this open-ended sense. It responds to something that is beyond it. It's a source of life and orientation of the plant. That's what the sun provides. If the time then is moving towards a purpose, there's this degree of randomness in how it's going to go, how history is going to unfold. So if time is going somewhere specific, if it is predetermined where time will go, which physics believes it is, and which I believe it is because I'm a Catholic and I believe it ends in the parousia, and then history is not just a record of what happened, but it's actually a process that moves towards something else, right? Or someone. And so this is deeply compatible with what Christian theology says about time and salvation, is that we are free, but we are also not without direction. We at least have the freedom to surrender. And there's still a lot we don't know about time and causality, so even in physics. So I'm not trying to make the full case, like I said, for the metaphysical determinism or theological inevitability here. My point is just more basic than that. It's that history alone and historians alone cannot answer those questions. So just as my own Catholic worldview informs how I interpret those facts, secular frameworks also bring their own presuppositions. So even when interpreting the very same data, I can accept the findings of biblical scholars and evolutionary biologists, but I'm not beholden to their philosophical conclusions or their presuppositions, especially when they start to drift into theological speculation. That is definitely beyond their scope, because theology is not strictly accidental. It involves real space and time, but it's not strictly so. And so you can't make an interpretation, and that's not, like, as a Catholic, I believe that interpretive authority belongs to the Apostolic Church, not to individuals, however brilliant they are outside of that tradition. They don't have the authority. I think it was Dan McClellan who said, the scripture is like a box of Legos. You can make anything you want out of it. I think that's true. That's why I'm Catholic. I think you can make it say anything you want it to say, but within the Catholic framework, it has a very cohesive message across time. Again, I'm not trying to make necessarily a positive case for my position here. I'm just saying here's an alternative way to look at the very same facts. Christianity teaches that time is not random, nor is it merely like the accumulation of events. It's not like these disjointed events that happen across time or that are only connected in some linear way. That actually has a direction towards Christ, towards the Logos, firstly in the creation moment to the incarnation, but then also from the incarnation to the second coming. And the incarnation is not just an event within history, it's the axis of history. So it is actually the thing which determines where history went and where evolution went, and then also where it's going to the parousia. So that might sound foreign to a secular historian, and again, I'm not saying what they have to believe or positing it. I'm just saying this is my perspective, and I can accept the same facts that you have. And it's internally coherent with the Catholic worldview. So if Christianity as a religion is going to be studied with intellectual integrity, then it must be studied on its own terms and within itself. If you're going to judge Christianity, you can't judge it merely by the historical data, but within its own framework, not merely as like this byproduct of its cultural surroundings. Christianity survived many socio-political revolutions and changes. Something separated it from those other myths, that it actually survived them. It not only survived, it actually reshaped entire civilizations. It's not something you can brush aside or reduce to accidental features. Historical criticism at best, it tells us what happened or what likely happened in this traceable, documentable way, but it cannot tell us what could have happened, right? Because it only works within actualized history. It cannot tell us what could have happened. It doesn't know the metaphysical possibilities. It only knows what happened, and that's it. History is blind to the constraints that time places on space, to the metaphysical conditions which certain events could have emerged at all. So you cannot chalk up, this only happened because of this accidental feature. You do not know that. You can see that in history that preceded that event, that it led to that event. So a historian could study why Christianity spread, but it cannot say whether any of the competing movements could have taken hold in its place under different circumstances. They simply do not know whether time itself was structured towards that outcome. Historical analysis is valuable, but it is also partial. So if you have Dan McClellan saying the only reason that the Trinity became an authoritative church teaching was because the church had structure to enforce that, right? That's not something that history can tell you. You can tell us where it was proclaimed. You can tell us where the church was at that time, but all of those are accidental features. Or if you say Christianity only spread because of the Roman Empire or the roads or whatever, that's speculation. You can tell us what happened, but it calls into question whether you're overstepping the scope of what you can truly be said through history. Another example, so I just watched a video, it was Robin Walsh. She was telling this idea that, Greco-Roman writers may have influenced or shaped some early Christian texts that were not so much a result of oral tradition written down, but more compiled by these elite scholars. Then she draws these comparisons between the gospel scenes and pagan literature. There was one point where she makes, I think it's the Satyricon comedy, where this person wants people to eat his body after he dies, and then makes that comparison with the Last Supper, as if they're the same motive. Theology aside, as someone who believes that the change is not physical, that it's not a carnal Christ, right? I have issues with that. But then it also looks only at that historical moment and does this one-for-one comparison, right? Just in that spatial plane. What it does not do is put the Last Supper in connection with the Jewish motives, which are unique. Like if you only focus on the Greco-Roman resonances, parallels, but then ignore the Jewish matrix in which those gospels were conceived, you're basically reducing it to the horizontal plane. As a Catholic, I believe that the Bible is not direct dictation, that it's got truly human authors while also being inspired by the Holy Spirit as a co-author. You can't just look at the horizontal plane, you have to look at the vertical plane, because with those Jewish motives, if you're looking for continuity within the Jewish tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's very evident. As a Catholic, I can go back and see the Old Testament theology, and I don't have to worry about whether camels existed at this time or that time. I can see that the theology is very, very much tied to my Catholic theology today. There's a remarkable continuity. There's remarkable building of revelation that is clear as interpreted by the Catholic Church. It might not be clear as interpreted by an evangelical or by Bart Ehrman, but it is clear within the authorities, I believe, were entrusted to interpret these books. The Gospels are saturated with Jewish ritual, with prophecy, with symbolic structure, and from like the Passover event, right, that is connected to the Last Supper, or covenant to temple theology, all of these things are connected. And their internal logic depends on Jewish thought to even make sense. So if you place a specific book next to other similar books at a specific time frame, and you say, well, which one's true because they're all fantastical, reducing theology to history. Theology doesn't just look on the historical plane, it looks on the vertical plane of where God truly acting within history and truly revealing things to his people over time. When I assess the truth of something, I think, how well does this hold up with other forms of thought? And in every age, the Bible is, from the beginning, creation myths, till the end of the Bible, it is always in conversation with other cultures and using those motives. What's distinct about it is that on the vertical plane, throughout history, there is true continuity that is able to speak to every single different plane, every different social construct, every different cultural understanding, while keeping continuity. So that's not just literature echoing the environment it's in, right? It's talking to the environment, subverting myth, taking the same motives and then reordering them to come to an entirely different conclusion. So it's literature that's born from a covenantal worldview where God really cares about us and invites us into relationship with him. And that has a Jewish cultural memory over thousands of years. And you see how the ancient pagan myths, the idea that the creation was accidental or chaotic or random, do you see how that very much is the same worldview that naturalists have today? It's like the exact same. You come away with the same understanding of who you are. But Genesis because I believe in evolution, right? But Genesis still stands alone in that it is ordered. Creation is peaceful, that it is good, that it's not just random, that it is actually good to be alive. That informs your life in an entirely different direction. For being one myth among many, it's interesting that it's still relevant today in terms of theology and in human anthropology. It informs the way you see the world. I don't believe the truth of Scripture depends on 100% literalism or even 100% accurate historical reporting, but on its unified meaning and its divine origin to teach us how to be in relationship with God. The Church's magisterium helps safeguard that interpretive coherence with Old Testament and New Testament. But historians often immediately rule out the possibility that God really does act in history, that God really does direct time towards an end. And the scriptural text, if it is inspired, which is not something historians can tell you, if it is inspired, then it was not merely written to be analyzed like any other text, but it was meant to be received, not like a doctor that's analyzing a mammogram, but like a child that receives true nourishment. It feeds the human heart, tells us the direction that we can live our lives, that we can live a life of meaning, of real meaning.